while the engines had been getting faster and more powerful over the decades, the humble carriages had seen few improvements, besides getting a bit bigger. But the 1870s would see many significant changes. Oil lamps were now becoming commonplace in carriages, which had previously been lit only by candles the passengers had brought with them. Gas lamps were also introduced around this time. In 1879, the first Pullman dining coaches were installed by Great Western, allowing passengers to enjoy a hot meal on the go. There were still no connections between carriages, so passengers who wished to eat would have to hurriedly change places at the stations. On the other end of proceedings, toilet stalls began to appear in coaches. One drawback was that passengers had to be in the right compartment in order to use them. Everyone else was limited to the chamber pots under their seats, the contents of which would be thrown out of the window, preferably in a sparsely populated area. Those with a bit more money, who wanted all of this in one place, could book a private carriage for themselves and their nearest and dearest, with luxury furniture, refreshments, and separate compartments for servants' quarters, toilets, beds, and occasionally baths. Where it was necessary to change trains, they could pay a bit more money to have their coach detached from the previous train and shunted onto the new one without themselves ever having to get out, though this could only be done where it wouldn't interrupt schedules. The private coaches had in fact been offered by Great Western as far back as 1838, but they had initially been unpopular. The rich preferred to ride in their own carriage, which would be loaded onto the back of a truck with them still inside. But as trains got faster, this arrangement had become increasingly precarious, and rich travellers had shifted to the private coaches instead. Officially, some companies offered the service as far as the First World War, but by the 1880s, accounts of it actually happening are few and far between. It wasn't only the rich who were seeing improvements. In the early days of the railways, third-class passengers were rarely allowed on the mainline services. The only way they could travel was in open wagons attached to goods trains, or in parliamentary trains which ran in dead hours. But as trains became cheaper to run, it became profitable to sell third-class tickets, and companies gradually came to realise what an untapped market they were missing out on, and so third-class services became increasingly common. What's more, old first-class carriages have been superseded by newer, nicer ones, which meant they can now be rebranded as third-class at minimal cost. In 1872, the Midlands Railway became the first to offer third-class tickets to all its services. Profits soared, and all other companies soon followed suit. With first class becoming grander, and third class becoming more available, second class was rapidly waning in popularity. Among the middle classes, those with money who wanted a better experience typically chose first class, while those who wanted to get where they were going cheaply typically chose third. Second now seemed like an unnecessary middle ground. The rail companies initially tried to encourage people to spend a bit more and get a second-class ticket by making third class seem as unattractive as they sensibly could. They would, for instance, hire chimney sweeps to sit in third-class carriages to ensure that they would maintain a grubby appearance. Nonetheless, second-class numbers continued to drop, and third class continued to rise. The law required companies to provide third-class services, but there was no law requiring them to provide a second class. In 1875, the Midlands Railway took the decision to eliminate second class altogether due to a lack of demand. Almost every other company followed suit, leaving Britain's railways in the bizarre position where they offered only first and third class travel. The third class would eventually be rebranded as second class in 1956, and finally as standard class in 1980. Switching to a two-class model allowed the companies to up the price of third class nearer to what second class had used to cost, but still within reach of the working classes. This was a great boost to their mobility. Up until now, many of them would live their entire lives in their hometown, and the other end of the country may as well be the moon. Now that their travel was no longer limited to hitching rides on goods trains, they could explore more and seek new opportunities that had previously only been available to those who could afford them. For many families, the new low fares granted them the opportunity to take proper holidays away from home for the first time, taking a weekend trip to the seaside, or visiting friends and family in other parts of the country. The cheaper travel also had a revolutionary effect on sport. At the start of the 19th century, most sporting competitions were amateur in nature, a weekend hobby for people with other jobs. Most sports people would be limited to local cups and friendly games, with nationwide competitions being big events only available to those who could afford to travel to them. Even in the early years of the FA Cup, it was common for teams to have to drop out due to having been drawn away and being unable to afford the rail fares. But now, with third-class travel being more available, it became possible for sports people to travel around the country regularly for fixtures, and for their fans to follow them. The later half of the 19th century would see an explosion in nationwide sporting competitions. The FA Cup began in 1872. Wimbledon saw its first tennis tournament in 1877. The Football League started in 1888. The first properly organised cricket league started in 1890. The Rugby League began in 1905. The third-class passengers weren't the only working-class people whose lives were improving on the railways. The workers too were making themselves heard. In 1872, the first properly organised railway workers' union was formed in Derby, with more than 17,000 members, known as the Amalgamated Society of Railway Servants, or ASRS. For its first 20 years or so, the ASRS existed as a friendly society, which deplored strikes, calling them an evil to masters and men. Nonetheless, the ASRS was working to bring changes, publishing the Railway Servants' Gazette as a means of spreading their experiences and ideas. One of their first major jobs was to collect accurate lists of railway worker injuries. The railway companies were required to keep similar lists, but were quite lax in actually doing so. In 1872, the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway Company reported 73 workplace injuries. The ASRS reported 1,387 in the same company. The ASRS may have been exaggerating, but it is certainly true that the railways were a very dangerous place to work. The 1870s were a peak time for fatalities, averaging 700 a year. The companies had covered themselves nicely by putting statements into worker contracts that each worker was responsible for their own safety. The only time the company could be held accountable was if an accident involved a worker from another company, or a member of the public. While instructing the workers to just be careful is all well and good in theory, in practice it allows employers to force them to work in environments where accidents are inevitable. Most dangerous of all were the goods yards, which were a lot more active and varied than the modern day ones, which made the yards quite chaotic, a problem for the workers dodging between the trains. Harsh weather and darkness made the job even more deadly, not least because there was rarely any lighting in the yards. Workers would just be given a lantern to carry, which wasn't a lot of help for tasks requiring two hands. The shunters had it hardest of all. They were required to uncouple and couple the goods wagons as required, as the long trains were slowly pulled past. This required them to hop up between the wagons, operate all of the catches, and often apply the brakes, which would almost always be on only one side of the wagon. And all of this had to be done in the space of about 5 seconds, giving them little time for care. But with pressure from the ASRS, the companies gradually came to adopt better, safer practices, installing proper lighting in the yards, and introducing shunters poles, which allowed them to operate the catches without having to climb between the trucks. But all of this was handled on the local level, and was not universally applied. Solid legislation on worker safety was slow in coming. The Liberal leader, William Gladstone, put forward several bills which would have brought in sweeping reforms, but was blocked by the Conservatives under Benjamin Disraeli, backed up by the owners of the companies, who insisted that being responsible for the workers' lives would cripple business, and by extension the economy. Instead, change would have to be made through a series of baby steps, which would take decades to accomplish. The death rate would never reach the 700 a year figure again, but well into the 20th century it was common for yearly fatalities on the railways to number in triple figures. One successful move the government did make in 1870 was to formalise the conditions under which tramways could be built in the country. The Tramways Act required all tracks to be dug into the road, all vehicles to be silent and limited in speed, and for the companies that ran them to take responsibility for the road's maintenance, including, of course, picking up after the horses. The government dealt with objections from omnibus companies by encouraging them to invest in trams as well. That way they could structure their routes to complement each other and avoid direct competition. The trams could provide an improved service on the wider streets, while the omnibuses could service the narrower, windier roads, and stops could be positioned to allow the traffic from each to feed into the other. The Tramways Act also set some standards on steam trams. To avoid disturbing horses, they had to have all machinery covered and maintain the same speed and noise limits as the horse-drawn trams, and also emit no visible smoke. These limits made steam trams difficult to operate, and though they had their applications, they were never as popular as other types. This legislation allowed the popularity of trams in the country to explode after their false start in the 1860s. By 1879, more than 1,000 kilometres of tramway had been built across the country in all sorts of towns and cities. In London, a healthy network was shaping up, both north and south of the Thames. Even George Francis Train was able to return to the country and build his tramways properly this time. The main line services too were continuing to grow. In 1877, the St Ives branch line was extended, making it the last piece of broad gauge to be built in the country. At the other end of the country, Trousseau Station opened in 1874, Britain's northernmost rail station. The network was now as close as it ever would be to allowing a traveller to travel all the way from Land's End to John O'Groats by train. But travelling up the east coast of Scotland was still rather difficult. The main issue was the firths of Tay and Forth. A traveller from Edinburgh to Dundee would have to disembark and take a ferry twice, or else take a huge detour inland. Either option would add more than an hour to the journey. The North British Railway particularly disliked the latter option, as it required them to pass passengers over to the Caledonian Railway. The obvious solution was to bridge the firths, but to do so would require engineers to construct what would at the time be the longest bridges in the world. Parliament approved the scheme in 1871, and the task fell to an engineer called Thomas Bouch, who began with designing the Tay Bridge. Bouch had an extensive track record for designing railways and viaducts. Unfortunately, much of his good reputation had been gained by his ability to get a job done quickly and cheaply, not something which was needed here. His plan was to build a series of brick supports, which would be constructed on land, then carried into the river and sunk into the river bed, until they came to rest on bedrock. But after the first 10 had been put in place, it was discovered that the silt became a lot thicker and a lot more uneven towards the centre of the firth than the initial dredging survey had suggested. Bouch adjusted his design. A series of brick caissons would be placed in the river and dug into the bed, then filled with concrete to create a platform, on which a lightweight hexagonal iron frame would be built to support the spans above. He also reduced the number of spans from 89 to 85. The single-track railway would sit on top of the ironwork for the large part, but in the centre were a series of tubular spans, known as the high irons, built that way to allow ships to pass underneath. Unfortunately, whilst Bouch had calculated the bridge's ability to withstand axial loads, such as its own weight and that of the train, he hadn't factored in longitudinal loads, such as the shaking of the train, the currents in the river, or the winds which can reach 90 km an hour in the Tay. Bouch, to his credit, did inquire with the Board of Trade how best to do such calculations, but was told there was no formal process, and at any rate such analyses were not necessary on his bridge, as all the spans were of a sufficiently short distance, under the Board of Trade regulations of the time. The last-minute redesign wreaked havoc with construction, but Bouch would do little to change the deadlines. To make matters worse, Bouch went with the lowest bidder when it came to construction companies, namely Hopkins Gilts and Company, who were in serious financial trouble themselves, and skimped over unimportant things like materials, buying their iron from highly questionable sources. Despite the ever-growing list of issues, the first trains ran over the completed bridge in 1877. In 1878, the Board of Trade inspected the bridge in calm weather and declared it safe, provided trains observe a 40 km/h speed limit, a speed limit the drivers would frequently ignore. Surprisingly, the Tay Bridge was hailed as an engineering triumph at the time. Bouch was even knighted for his work. The North British Railway were also thrilled to see their profits up, with a more than 40% increase in traffic along the east coast. Such was the hubris that it led people to blank out clear signs that the bridge was shaking itself to pieces. Locals reported hearing the bridge rattling like mad every time a train went over it, or the wind was up. Meanwhile, workers found themselves constantly having to secure their paint pots and their tools, as the bridge would shake so violently from side to side, even sending shockwaves ahead of the trains. They also noticed supports shifting and rivets elongating over time. Many of these comments were brought to Bouch, but he paid them little attention, having become absorbed in designing the fourth bridge. He insisted the Tay Bridge was just settling. Finally, on the 28th of December 1879, on a particularly stormy night, the signal box at the south end of the bridge let a train through. The signalman then went to make some tea, but a visiting friend watched the train go past. He observed sparks on the wheels as it was blown right up against the rails, and as it was travelling out over the bridge, he saw its rear light flare up for a moment and then disappear sooner than he was expecting, but he put this down to the weather. However, after half an hour, the signalmen had heard nothing from the signal box at the north end, and when they tried to raise them on telegraph, they found the line was down. The two of them went out onto the bridge to see what was happening, and they were shocked by what they discovered. Several iron columns had collapsed, throwing the high iron spans above into the Tay, with the entire train encased within, and killing everybody on board, an estimated 75 people. To date, it is the only British railway disaster to leave behind no survivors. The subsequent inquiries placed the blame firmly at Bouch's door, and similar flaws were found in many of his other viaducts, many of which would be subsequently rebuilt. Meanwhile, his plans for the fourth bridge were thrown out. Bouch always denied his guilt, insisting the train must have derailed, a concept which is possible but which there is no clear evidence. At any rate, Bouch was a ruined man, and the grief likely led to his death in 1881. In many ways, the Tay Bridge is the Titanic of bridge building, a once celebrated engineering triumph which was brought down to earth all too quickly, and taught some valuable lessons in the process. The Board of Trade created stricter procedures for ensuring that a structure must be able to withstand longitudinal loads, while structural engineers took on board the fact that a framework must be designed to withstand loads many times what it is likely to experience in its use, just in case something is to go wrong, or someone is to overload it. The Tay Bridge was the deadliest rail disaster to date, but it would have little effect on the growth of the network. Passenger numbers will continue to grow, plans to bridge the Firths will be renewed, and new technologies will be created to bring further boost to the railways. But that is a subject for next time. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe if you would like to see more, and check out my website for more examples of my artwork, link in the description below. Part 7 should be out sometime in August. I shall see you then.